Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. This is the Shared Responsibility Model lecture, and this is one of the most fundamental concepts of security in AWS. You need to understand this model inside out if you want any chance in passing your exams. It's also really important to know for real life as well. So we'll make this a little bit fun. It can be a dry topic, but it is really, really important to understand this well. So, what is the shared responsibility model? Well, while AWS manages security of the cloud, security in the cloud is the responsibility of the customer. So, it's your responsibility to be secure in the cloud. Customers maintain control of what security they choose to implement to protect their own content, platform applications, systems, and networks no differently than they would an on site data center. And I like using the analogy of if you're renting a house, the security of the actual house itself is the landlord's responsibility. So they've got to, obviously put up fences. They've got to have, an alarm, put in the fire alarms, that sort of thing. But the actual security of the objects inside the house is your responsibility. If you leave your front door wide open and somebody comes in and robs you, that is not your landlord's, responsibility or fault. That's your own fault because you've left your front door wide open. So I like to think of it as that kind of analogy. So, what is AWS's responsibilities and what are your responsibilities? So, this can be very broad and it can also depend on the service that we're talking about, as you'll soon see. So, AWS's security responsibilities from a broad sense is on global infrastructure. So, they're responsible for their data centers. They're also responsible for the hardware, so all the networking, all the SAN, storage arrays, all the physical servers, etc. They're also responsible for the software that they install on there, depending on the service. So the hypervisors, definitely they're responsible for. Some operating systems they'll be responsible for, things like RDS, for example. And they're obviously responsible for all the facilities inside the data center. And then they're also responsible for some managed services. So these are things like S3, things like DynamoDB, etc. And we'll come to how that breaks out in a little bit. What is the customer's responsibilities? Well, they're responsible for infrastructure as a service, so things like EC2, and we'll explore that in a little bit. They're responsible for including things like updates and security patches. So you're responsible to go in and patch your EC2 instance. You've got to always apply yum update or do the Windows updates when it first launches, and then apply all relevant security patches. And you're also responsible for the configuration of the AWS provided firewall. And by that, we're just talking about things like your VPC rules. So we're talking about things like security groups. We're talking about things like network ACLs, etc. So let's have a look at the shared responsibility model. So we've already covered security of the cloud in the previous lecture. In the next lecture, we're going to cover security in the cloud, and then we'll basically round up of what we've learned so far. So security of the cloud are things like compute, storage, database, networking, regions, availability zones, edge locations, etc. Essentially, it's where you don't get access to the underlying operating system. If you don't have access to the underlying operating system, then Amazon is responsible for patching that. In some cases, you don't even get access to the underlying applications. So things like DynamoDB, S3, these are abstracted services. You don't even have access to that. You're only then responsible for things like encryption, encryption at rest, encryption in transit, etc. And we'll explore that in a little bit. And then in terms of what the customer is responsible for, they're responsible for security in the cloud. So this might be things like client-side encryption and data integrity and authentication, things like server-side encryption, both from a file system or data point of view, network traffic protection. So this is, are you using HTTPS when you're uploading your, files to Amazon? Things like operating systems, network, and firewall configuration. So you're responsible for your EC2 instances, you're responsible for your security groups, you're responsible for your network ACLs, platforms, applications, identity, and access management. Again, things you're definitely responsible for IAM if you go out and provision a user who has full admin access, and then for some reason you issue an access key ID and secret access key, and that code goes up onto GitHub, well, there are bots out there that scan GitHub just looking for access key IDs and secret access keys. And as soon as they find them, they go in and try and provision EC2 instances to mine Bitcoin. So, you're responsible for securing things like that. And obviously, you're always going to be responsible for your own customer data. It's not Amazon's responsibility. So the model changes for the different service types. So we have 3 different service types. We have infrastructure, we have container, and we have abstracted. And it's really, really important that you understand the 3 different types and the different examples of different services for how the model changes, because you're going to be tested on this a lot. So let's start with infrastructure services. So this category includes compute services such as EC2, EBS, autoscaling, and VPC. With these services, you can architect and build a cloud infrastructure using technologies similar and largely compatible with on-premise solutions. You control the operating systems, and you configure and operate any identity management system that provides access to the user layer of the virtualization stack. So that makes total sense, right? EC2, EBS, things like autoscaling, things like VPC, things like your security groups within your VPC, your network ACLs. In terms of EC2, in fact, let's have a look at the next slide. So if we think about EC2, you're going to be responsible for things like your Amazon machine images, your operating systems, your applications, your data in transit, and your data at rest. You're responsible for your data stores. You're responsible for the credentials, the private key and the public key. Those credentials are your responsibility. If you put your private key somewhere up on the internet and somebody finds it, well, you've just given away the keys to the kingdom, so don't do that. And then policies and configurations. So from an infrastructure point of view, you're basically responsible from the operating system level up. Moving on to container services. In this, you've got a service that's running on an EC2 instance or some form of other infrastructure instance, but you don't manage the operating system. That's the responsibility of Amazon, and Amazon call this container services. So you'll be responsible for setting up and managing network controls such as firewall rules, and for managing platform level identity and access management separately from IAM. So examples of container services include things like RDS, Elastic MapReduce, and Elastic Beanstalk. And RDS is the one that I think of all the time because, you've got a database there that you can install and access, but you don't manage the underlying operating system. In that respect, Amazon are responsible for both the patching of the operating system as well as the patching of the security patching of your RDS instance as well. So security patching of MySQL or SQL Server or Oracle or whatever. We then have abstracted services, and this includes high-level storage, databases, messaging services, and things such as like S3 or Glacier or DynamoDB or SQS or SES. And these services basically abstract the platform or management layer on which you can build and operate your cloud applications. You can still access endpoints of these abstracted services using the APIs, but AWS manages the underlying service components or the operating systems on which they reside. So you don't have to worry about patching the OS or patching the actual application that runs S3. Amazon are going to take care of all that for you. In terms of S3, what you do need to worry about is your bucket policies, for example. That is absolutely your responsibility. If you set a bucket policy that allows people to read and write the entire contents of your bucket, that's pretty silly. So that is your responsibility. So my exam tips. Go in having a very strong understanding of the shared responsibility model. This will be whether or not you pass your exam or fail your exam, to be honest, because you have to have a very fundamental understanding of the shared responsibility model. Remember, the model changes for the 3 different service types. So infrastructure, so these are things like EC2, EBS, VPC, etc. Then container services, Amazon will be responsible for the actual operating system and the container itself. So this could be things like the operating system and then, in RDS, this would be things like the operating system and then SQL Server itself or MySQL or whatever it is that you're running. And then we have abstracted, and this is where Amazon are basically responsible for almost everything apart from the actual, whether or not you're storing things like, let's look at S3. Amazon are responsible all the way up to the application layer. You're responsible for whether or not your data is encrypted at rest. You're responsible for your network, your bucket policies, etc., etc. So just have a strong understanding of the shared responsibility model and how it changes across infrastructure, across containers, and across your abstracted services. So that is it for this lecture, guys. In the next lecture, we're going to have a look at security in the cloud. So if you've got the time, join me in the next lecture. Thank you.